In just one evening on Saturday, the Orioles filled both of the holes among their position player group on the roster. They got their right-handed hitting outfielder in Tyler O'Neill, signing him to a 3-year deal, and they got their backup catcher as they're bringing in Gary Sánchez. We'll tell you about his deal with the Orioles and how he fits on this roster coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Sunday, December 8th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about the second of the Orioles' two free agent signings they made on Saturday. They signed Tyler O'Neill to a 3-year deal, and they have signed veteran catcher Gary Sánchez to a 1-year deal. We'll talk about how he fits in as Adley's backup, what greater upside he could bring than the guy he's replacing in James McCann, and kind of what would make this deal go right or go wrong for the Orioles. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So as I was recording on Saturday evening, talking about the Orioles' 3-year contract they gave out to right fielder Tyler O'Neill to come in and presumably replace Anthony Santander on this team. As I was recording, the Orioles made a second signing. So I mentioned it briefly at the end of Saturday's episode. If you haven't, check that one out. Make sure to check it out wherever you get your podcasts and here on YouTube. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. But they made another signing as well, and a little bit of a lesser one, but one we were expecting the Orioles to make. They needed a backup catcher. James McCann had become a free agent, and although the Orioles were certainly interested in bringing him back, that is not the move they made. Instead, they have signed Gary Sánchez to a 1-year, $8.5 million deal to be their backup catcher in 2025. So let's start with, who is Gary Sánchez? What is this contract? And how does he fit with the Orioles? Jon Heyman first reporting that 1-year, $8.5 million deal. And the free agent matrix that we use from John Becker at FanGraphs had a 1-year, $4.5 million prediction on Gary Sánchez. So maybe a little bit more money than he was expecting to get. But this is a case of the Orioles just paying a little bit extra to get the guy that they wanted at this position, because I don't think anyone was going to sign Gary Sánchez to be their starting catcher. So Sanchez's options were being a backup. And I would guess $8.5 million is the most money he was offered in a 1-year deal to be a backup catcher. So this is a sense, and it's on a small scale for a backup catcher on a 1-year deal, where the Orioles presumably did outbid other teams to go and get Gary Sánchez. This is not like Robinson Chirinos, the 1 year he was with Baltimore, now current Orioles bench coach Robinson Chirinos, where the Orioles gave him like $700,000 over 1 year and were probably the only team to offer him a major league deal, and that's why he came to Baltimore. No, like other teams certainly wanted Gary Sánchez as their backup, but the O's are willing to pay a little bit more, and they get Gary here to Baltimore. And again, there was reported interest in a James McCann reunion, but there was some reporting around McCann actually seeking a 2-year deal potentially this offseason, which seems unlikely. And the Orioles just didn't want to give out 2 years to a backup catcher, knowing that Samuel Basallo is close. And the hope is that your two catchers will be Basallo and Rutschman in 2026 from the beginning of the year. So you really just need a 1 more year of a stopgap catcher. That's why they were looking at 1-year deals, and they settled on Gary Sánchez. Now, who is Gary Sánchez? If you don't know him well, he is a 32-year-old right-handed hitting catcher, actually just turned 32 last week. And he's been in the big leagues for a while. Originally just briefly debuted a September call-up for the Yankees in 2015, but really burst onto the scene in 2016 with the New York Yankees. He made his presence known that year. He played in just 53 games, but he hit .299 with a 170 WRC plus and 20 homers in 53 games that season. He was a top catching prospect who got to the big leagues with the Yankees at age 23 and basically immediately started to rake. He had a fantastic year in his first full season the next year in 2017 with New York. Did take a little step back in 2018, but then bounced back with a fairly good 2019 season with the Yankees. But all this time, there were questions about his defense. He was basically the worst blocking and receiving catcher in baseball. He couldn't frame. Balls would get by him. He couldn't make plays at the plate. Like, it was tough to watch him play defense. And it all kind of came together in the shortened 2020 season when he hit 147 and the defense was still bad. And at that point, Yankees fans were kind of just over him. Now, he played one more year in New York, was basically a league average hitter in 2021, and the Yankees sent him on his way. They traded him to the Twins in his final year before free agency, and he was not that good in Minnesota in 2022. So he hit free agency last year, and nobody really knew like what to make of Gary Sanchez as a free agent. He signed a deal with the Mets. That didn't really work out. Got waived, jumped on with the Giants, was in AAA, but never got to the big leagues. They released him, and then he got signed by the Padres. And that is where he kind of looked like the old Gary Sanchez. 72 games with the Padres, 260 plate appearances. He hit only 218, but he had 19 homers. He had a 500 slugging percentage. He had a 114 WRC plus, and his defense started to tick up. It had been doing that in Minnesota a little bit, but got a lot better in San Diego. And that earned him a one-year contract with the Milwaukee Brewers this season. Again, not the best offensive year. Now, he missed a little time with injury and was not the number one catcher in Milwaukee. I mean, they had William Contreras, arguably the best offensive catcher in baseball right now. So Sanchez was a backup. He played 89 games. He had 280 plate appearances. He hit 11 home runs. He batted .220 with a .307 on base and a .392 slugging percentage, good for a 96 WRC plus, so just below a league average hitter, with a 9.6% walk rate and a 27.1% strikeout rate for Gary Sanchez this season. And it was kind of a typical year for a backup catcher, to be honest. His defense was solid again, which was a good step in the right direction. The Brewers continuing to improve catchers defensively. They did it with William Contreras. They made Gary Sanchez better, even as their backup as well. But that's what he's coming into Baltimore to do. Like, the Brewers have their franchise catcher in William Contreras. Sanchez sat behind him. The Orioles have their franchise catcher in Adley Rutschman, and that's what Gary Sanchez is coming in to do. But he gives you a little bit of something extra because he can handle the bat. He hits the ball hard. He can DH against lefties. He can play a little first base if you need him to. He did that some in Milwaukee as well. So he gives you some options to get him into the lineup more than you necessarily like wanted to get James McCann in the lineup at certain times with the Orioles. But he'll be the backup catcher. But he also has a better bat. And maybe at this point, like, he's probably a better defensive catcher than James McCann at this point too. So it's not like the biggest upgrade in the world. But I know Adley struggled down the stretch, but he's an all-star catcher. When you had Adley Rutschman, you don't need the biggest defensive upgrades, offensive upgrades for your backup catcher, but they still upgraded in Gary Sanchez. And I would think that because Sanchez hits lefties pretty well, they would expect him to catch a lot of the games when a lefty is on the mound for the opponent with Adley DHing. And then Gary Sanchez will still do the regular backup catcher duties, catching the day game that comes right after a night game. Essentially, Gary Sanchez just coming in to be the better version of James McCann. The Orioles had 43 games last year against left-handed starters. This year, Sanchez will start a good chunk of those as long as he's swinging the bat. And last year, Gary Sanchez, 96 WRC plus, James McCann, 89. Gary Sanchez, -1 fielding runs value as a defensive catcher, so just below average. James McCann, -7 fielding run values as a defensive catcher. So Sanchez better with the stick, better behind the plate. And also, Gary Sanchez is 2.5 years younger than James McCann as well, and especially in the catcher position that takes a bigger toll on your body than anywhere else on the diamond. This might not be the biggest upgrade, but I think you can agree, Gary Sanchez, an upgrade at backup catcher over James McCann. And I would have been perfectly fine, perfectly okay with the Orioles bringing back James McCann for one more season. I talked about it all offseason, like I was down with it. But if they're not going to do it, at least get somebody who upgrades at least slightly. That seems to be what they have here with James McCann. So let's talk about, okay, why is this specifically an upgrade? What does Gary Sanchez do well, especially at the plate, but also behind the plate, that makes him a better option than McCann. We'll talk about those green flags for Sanchez coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Omaha Steaks. Now, nothing delivers comfort and joy quite like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks. This year, skip the holiday hustle and bustle and save 50% off site-wide during their cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, get a $30 reward card when you shop early and score an extra $30 off with promo code MLB. With 5 generations of experience, Omaha Steaks consistently delivers the world's best steaks experience, and their gifting experts have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages starting at $89.99. From legendary steaks to mouth-watering desserts and more, save 50% off site-wide during the cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code MLB and a $30 reward card when you shop early. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com and an extra $30 off with promo code MLB. Minimum purchase may apply. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by the DK Law Group. When you need a law firm, do you want the legal runaround or would you rather have a no-nonsense approach? Well, you get the latter with the DK Law Group. The DK Law Group specializes in real estate law, estate planning, business law, and family law. They're tech savvy, they treat their clients like family, and they focus on keeping your legal solutions simple. And the DK Law Group knows that speed is key. By leveraging technology, the DK Law Group streamlines the process to serve you better and faster. So contact the DK Law Group today at dklawmd.com. And Locked On Orioles listeners can call today to schedule a free 30-minute consultation when you mention the tagline, Empowering Legacies. So what does Gary Sánchez do well, and what will he do well, potentially in an Oriole uniform as their backup catcher in 2025? We start with the green flags, why this deal might work out at 1 year, $8.5 million for Sanchez and the Orioles. And we start with Gary Sánchez overall. Just he's been a good hitting catcher, really good hitter overall, but specifically a good hitting catcher in his big league career. 108 career WRC plus in 830 MLB games. I mentioned as recently as 2023, he was really good with the Padres, more like a league average hitter last year with the Milwaukee Brewers. But the big part of his game is he still hits the ball hard. Now, it's not what he was early in his Yankee career when he was just an exit velocity hard hit darling, 50% hard hit rates, 17, 18% barrel rates. Like, those weren't just leading catchers. Those are some of the best numbers among all position players in baseball. That was how good he was when he was a Yankee early in his career. It's not that anymore, but he still posted a 15% barrel rate in 2023, followed it up with a 10.5% barrel rate and a 44% hard hit rate this year. I mean, if you combine 2023 and 24, Gary Sánchez, 5th among Major League Baseball catchers in barrel rate. Remember, a barrel is a ball that's hit in a certain zone, combining launch angle and exit velocity that usually leads to home runs and extra base hits. And if you have a barrel rate up above 10%, you are really crushing the baseball when you get to it. And that's what Sanchez is still able to do despite being a backup catcher. And among all the catchers that were available in free agency this offseason, like, he is by far the best one when it comes to hitting the ball consistently hard. And while his numbers are not what they were 5 years ago with the Yankees, they're still considered very good. Again, 5th in Major League Baseball in catchers over the past 2 years. And he still had a max exit velocity of 114.4 miles an hour. That was in the 93rd percentile of all of Major League Baseball, not just 93rd percentile among catchers, 93rd percentile in all of the majors for max exit velocity this year. Like, 114.4, to put that into perspective, that is equal to Anthony Santander's maximum exit velocity this year. And that Santander max EV, that was his hardest hit ball of the season. That was pretty much the hardest hit ball by a regular Oriole this year, which is quite impressive. So basically, you put Gary Sánchez in this lineup, and we'll get to some of the things that he is not able to do, which, he certainly has some flaws, but there's nobody on this Orioles roster that hit a ball harder last year than Gary Sánchez did. And hitting the ball hard and hitting the ball in the air, which Sánchez does a good job of as well, generally leads to good things, especially when you're a right-handed hitter, and the Orioles have brought that left field wall in a little bit as well for 2025. Now, he was kind of an even splits guy last year. He was only slightly better against left-handed pitching than he was against right-handed pitching, and some of that's because he was just kind of a league average hitter. But in the past, he has been at times a lefty masher, and especially in 2023 when he had that really good, run in the last 3-4 months of the year with the San Diego Padres after it didn't work out with the Mets and the Giants. He was annihilating left-handed pitching, had a 161 WRC plus and a 680 slugging percentage in about 80 plate appearances against lefties in 2023. Now, it's a small sample size, I get it, but over his career, he's always been better against lefties, but he doesn't have a gigantic split in his career. He's still generally been able to hit right-handers, which is a good mix for a backup catcher where, yeah, you can pick his spots, but you're going to play most Sundays, right? You can't pick all lefties to pitch against you on Sundays. You don't get to make that decision. So it's nice that he's not completely leaning one way, but he has had years where he just terrorizes left-handed pitching. And his ability to do that and just the ability to hit the ball hard and have this good track record as an offensive player just kind of allows you to have him do just a little bit more than your typical backup catcher, like allows you to trust him versus left-handed pitching. Like he's a guy where when he's on, you would think about, even if Adley was catching, you would think about DHing Gary Sánchez with a left-hander on the mound when he is on, because that's how good he can be against left-handed pitching. And that's what the Orioles thought they might have had at the beginning when they first traded for James McCann in 2023. Unfortunately, didn't end up being the case. But McCann only had like a couple of good offensive years. Sanchez's offensive history has much more accolades and just much better than James McCann's was 2 years ago when he joined the Orioles. So if the O's do want to go that route with Sanchez and play him a lot more against lefties, maybe even DH him some against lefties, he's got more of a track record to just be able to do that. And again, that can just allow you to get Adley off his feet a little bit more, rest him a little bit more, because we still don't exactly know what the heck happened to him in the second half last year, but maybe a little less time behind the plate earlier in the year can help out. And if you know that Gary Sánchez, hey, Adley, every time we play a lefty, you're going to DH and Gary's going to catch. That can get him into a better routine to start, just a little load management, helping out his body a little bit, like that can work. And the other good thing about Gary Sánchez is, despite the fact that his reputation is of this terrible, horrific defensive catcher, and trust me, I'm sure I've said as much back when he was with the Yankees, like it was atrocious to watch him behind the plate when he was a Yankee. Things have changed. Things have really, really changed. Like at one point, he was legitimately the worst defensive catcher in baseball. Actually, in his final year with the Yankees in 2021, he was worth -12 value in terms of fielding runs value by StatCast, which is like their all-encompassing defensive metrics, which allows you to compare catchers to all other positions. He was, by that stat, the worst defensive player in baseball that year. Not just the worst defensive catcher, the worst defensive player in the major leagues in 2021. That's how bad it got. But it was kind of all uphill from there. He'd always had a really good arm behind the plate, but he was a terrible framer, terrible blocker. All of a sudden, he joins the Twins in 2022 and became league average at some of those things and stayed like an average around that framer with the Padres 2 years ago and kept with that good defense and continued to improve on things with the Brewers in 2024. And the Brewers, they've really changed some catchers back there. They almost completely fixed William Contreras' defense. There wasn't as much they could do with Gary Sánchez, but they made him better back there. And now he's more of like a league average defensive catcher with more pop than most catchers have in their bats, which has kind of re-upped his value even at age 32. And there's some quotes, some really good quotes from Blake Snell when Snell was with the Padres and pitching to Sanchez in 2023. And Gary Sánchez almost basically turned into Blake Snell's personal catcher down the stretch that year. And Snell like raved about how, all he had heard is that Sanchez's defense was bad, but he was like, this guy's great back there. He calls a great game. He blocks balls in the dirt. Like, Snell could be a little bit wild. Like, that's one of the best pitchers in baseball, having great things to say about Gary Sanchez's defense. So he's not going to be elite back there. Like, that's not the case. But I know in your mind, you're thinking, oh, I know Gary Sánchez. He's a terrible defensive catcher. That is not really the case anymore. And that's one of the big reasons why the Orioles gave him $8.5 million to replace James McCann and come in and be their backup catcher, because McCann's defense has certainly fallen off, so it's not as hard to be better than him, but staunchly across the board, not just as a hitter, which we kind of knew, Sanchez is a better defensive catcher, full stop, than James McCann is as well, and it just makes him more valuable in this backup role. But Sanchez isn't perfect, and there's a lot of reasons why he's not getting paid as a starting catcher. No one's bringing him in to be their number one, because he certainly has his flaws, and we will get to those to finish out the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So thanks for bearing with me. I'm still getting over something. My voice is not all the way back here. We're trying to make it through the episode here, but we're talking to Gary Sánchez. And listen, I'm going to talk about his flaws now. Like, there is no backup catcher who is without flaws. The reason a guy is a backup catcher is because they have flaws. So this kind of does come with the territory when you sign a guy for 1 year, $8.5 million to be your backup to your all-star catcher. Like, he's not going to be a perfect player. But even with the defensive improvements, he still doesn't have that classic backup catcher defense. When you think about a number 2 catcher, you think about a guy who's great with your pitching staff, amazing framer, good throwing arm, great blocker. Maybe doesn't have much of a bat, but really defends back there. That's not really Gary Sánchez. He's the guy with the bat. He was still -1 in framing value in 2024. His pop time and his arm strength did take a step back this season. That used to be his one defensive calling card. That despite the inability to frame or block, he had this elite arm back there back in the day with the Yankees. That it's still a good arm, but it's not as much the case anymore as he gets into his 30s, and some of that is age as well. So although the numbers at least show he's going to be better back there than James McCann was, he's not quite what you think of as a backup catcher. And those big exit velocity numbers I was talking about, the big hard hit rates, like, they are going down. Now, they're still certainly high, but will they continue to drop as he ages? Now, the O's have only signed him to a 1-year deal, so it's not like they have a 4-year commitment to him, but it's not like he was a great hitter last year. It was 96 WRC plus. He was just below league average. I mean, he hit 220, and that was, this is going to sound bad, but 220 was his best batting average since 2019 when he hit 232. Now, as you know, if you listen to this podcast, batting average is not a lot of things that I look at when evaluating a hitter, but that's a part of Gary Sanchez's game. And when he does make that contact, he's got to make the most of it. And if those hard hit rates even start to drop off a little bit, which they did just a tiny bit last year, will that production drop as well? And strikeouts are an issue for Gary Sánchez as well. Like, not going to hide from the fact that he had a 27.1% strikeout rate last year. And while that number was basically his second lowest since 2018, so he's been worse in that category, certainly, and recently. And it's a 9.6% walk rate. That's his highest since 2021. So he still knows how to get on base from time to time, but that's a pretty high strikeout rate. It's a 30.4% swing and miss rate. That would have been the second highest on the Orioles last year. Only Austin Slater among the O's had a higher swing and miss rate than Gary Sanchez's 30.4. So that's something to watch. He does whiff in the zone a good amount as well. And, you know, he's crushed fastballs his whole career. He crushed fastballs last year. But when you throw him breaking balls or off-speed pitches, he had a whiff rate of over 40% against both breaking balls and off-speed pitches, which is basically changeups and splitters, in 2024. Like, the book is there on how to get Gary Sánchez out. Now, if you make a mistake, he will make you pay, because he can hit the ball hard, he can hit the ball in the air, and he's got those numbers that lead to some monster Gary Sánchez home runs. You've seen him hit them with the Yankees and with other teams against the Orioles as well. But there's certainly some flaws, some holes that are in that swing. And he's a backup catcher, so we're not going to see him in the lineup every single day, and they're not going to come up every single day. But he's still going to get chances in big spots, especially potentially against left-handers. And that's where you have to think about those holes that are in his swing. And okay, how will they affect the Orioles? Because he does do a lot better job of making contact against left-handers than right-handers, but there's still an issue in his game. I mean, it's not Tyler O'Neill like we talked about yesterday. Like, he's got more strikeout in the game than Gary Sanchez does, but it's there and it's a flaw. And again, he's a backup catcher, so he's going to come with flaws. And that's kind of the big thing here, right? Like, it's a backup catcher on a 1-year deal. So overall, it is low risk. It's a guy you're sitting on the bench more than half the time. It's a guy you have no commitment to beyond 2025. It's a guy who's just a stopgap because you're fairly sure Samuel Basallo will be in that spot, your top prospect in 2026, to go along with your all-star starting catcher in Adley Rutschman. So there's not a lot of room where this would really, really fail. Because if Gary Sanchez is like really bad, you still have Blake Hunt and Rene Pinto around as kind of depth as third and fourth catchers to maybe step in. And you could go with those guys in backup roles. If Adley's healthy and producing, you're fine with Hunt or Rene Pinto back there. But Sanchez gives you an extra level that you're hoping to get. And that's why you're signing him to an $8.5 million deal to come in and be behind Adley. So, if he does get hurt, if he doesn't produce the plate, he can't be relied on to spell Adley. I guess that's somewhat of a failure. But again, these 1-year deals for backup players are fairly low risk as it goes. But, this does mean James McCann officially, just like it was with Santander for Tyler O'Neill, James McCann will not be back in Baltimore. And he's been a pretty solid backup catcher for the last 2 years. And he's also been one of the biggest leaders in that Orioles clubhouse. And it's a clubhouse that many feel might need some more leadership. So maybe different leadership voices will help them kind of get over that postseason hump, the failures and the sweeps of the last 2 years. And Sanchez, being a veteran, been around, played in the AL East for a long time, maybe he will bring kind of a different kind of leadership that the Orioles could need, maybe a different kind of edge that the O's are looking for. But we will certainly see. But if he can produce a little more than McCann and be a little better defensively than McCann, then he is that perfect 1-year stopgap for the Orioles. And it is pretty impressive how much he has improved his defense since he was with the Yankees. That tells me that he is willing to get better, willing to learn, willing to do anything he can to help out his ball club. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Winter meetings. People kind of getting down to Dallas today. They kick off tomorrow. They are this week. Historically, there's at least a solid amount of deals go down at the winter meetings with all the GMs and everyone together. Not as much as it used to be because you have phones now and you have the internet, but there's still more stuff than in a usual week that goes down at the winter meetings. So my recording schedule will be a little bit different this week. I'll still have shows every day, at least Monday through Thursday, but those shows will go up in the evenings. They'll go up around 7, 8, 9, 10 p.m. to kind of recap the news, the rumors, anything we get about the Orioles from that day at the winter meetings. Some of them may be live. Stay tuned for that. Some of them may not, but you'll still kind of get your episodes in the evenings instead of the mornings to keep hold of what's going on in Dallas at the winter meetings. And that next episode will be on Monday evening. We'll talk about Tim Fedorovich, former big leaguer who's been hired to replace Buck Britton and be the AAA Norfolk Tides manager in 2025. We'll talk about the reporting from Ken Rosenthal that the Orioles are being scared off from free agent pitchers who have the qualifying offer attached. I've got some serious thoughts about that, and I'll get to them tomorrow, plus some O's with some connections to Nathan Eovaldi, maybe a Jack Flaherty reunion, and also how close the Orioles were to signing guys like Randall Grichuk and Clay Holmes, especially Holmes, who signed with the Mets just a couple of days ago. But that's coming up on tomorrow's episode. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.